early 1890s. $661. Let's get started. Well, forgive me for messing up names and reading incorrectly and not being able to. But let's read this. At least I could be a voice for like if people need to go read it. Maybe I could be one of those voices that are a good voice to listen to besides the pronunciation sometimes. The bake next door. Oh, okay. All right. All right, so we go. Indeed, it is a singular commentary on the attitude of the government to remember that the Freedmen's Bureau itself during the first years was financed, but not by taxation, but by the toil of ex-slaves. The total amount of rent collected from lands and in the hands of the Bureau, paid mostly by black people, amounted to $400,000. And curiously enough, it was this rent that supported the Freedmen's Bureau during the first years. Surprise and ridicule has often been voiced concerning this demand of black people for land. It has been regarded primarily as a method of pushing rebellion. Motives of this sort may have been in the minds of some northern whites, but so far as black people were concerned, their demand for a reasonable part of the land on which they had worked for a quarter of a millennium was absolutely justified. And to give them anything less than this was an economic farce. I agree. On the other hand, to have given each one of the million black people free families, a 40 acres freehold would have made a basis for real democracy in the United States that might easily have transformed the modern world. The law of June 21st, 1860 opened public lands in Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, and Florida. But comparatively, few of the freemen could take advantage of this offer. The Bureau gave some instance in transporting families, but most black people had neither stock nor farm implements, and the whites in those localities bitterly opposed their settling. Only about 4,000 families out of the nearly 4 million people acquired homes under this act. The Sherman Order gave rise to all sorts of difficulties. Black people were given only possessory titles. Then the owners came back and immediately there was trouble. Black people protested, quote, "What is the use of giving us freedom if we can't stay where we are raised where we were raised and own our own house, where we were born, and our own piece of ground." It was on May 25th, 1865 that Johnson, in his proclamation of pardon, had provided easy means whereby all property could be restored except the land at Port Royal, which had been sold for taxes. General Howard came to Charleston to make an arrangement, and the story is characteristic. Quote, "At first," said a witness, "the people hesitated, but soon as the meeting struck them that they must give up their little homes and gardens and work for others, there was a general murmuring and dissatisfaction. General Howard was called upon to address them and to cover his own confusion and sympathy. He asked them to sing. Immediately, an old woman on the outskirts of the meeting began, quote, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen," Howard wept. The landholders, that people of color landholders, I know this is the part where it's weird because they use the word color and then they put landholders. So it's like people of color landholders drew up a illiterate petition to Andrew Johnson. The poor whites expressed, quote, "sad feelings over his decree and begged for the acre and a half of land each. But naturally, nothing came of it, for President Johnson, forgetting his own pre-war declaration that the, quote, great plantations must be seized, and divided into small farms, end quote, declaring that this land must be restored to its original owners, and this would be done if owners received a presidential pardon. The pardoning power was pushed, and the land all over the South rapidly restored. Black people were dispossessed, and revenue of the Bureau reduced. Many schools had to be discontinued. The Bureau became no longer self-supporting, and its whole policy was changed. In December 1865, the Bureau had 768,590 acres of land. In 1868, there were only 139,000 acres, 139,644 acres left, and much of this unimproved and unfertile. For a long time, there still persists the idea that the government was going to make a distribution of land. The rumor was that this was to be made January 1st, 1865, and for months before that, black people all over the South declined to make contracts for work and were accordingly accused of laziness and insubordination. The restoration of the land not only deprived black people in various ways of a clear path forward towards livelihood, but greatly discouraged them and broke their faith in the United States government. Hello. This disappointment and discouragement did not for a moment stop the individual efforts and exceptional and lucky black people to get hold of land. And the cheapness of the land enabled them to make purchases on a considerable scale, where they could get hold of money of a money wage. The land holdings of black people increased all over the South. In South Carolina, the gradual subdivisions of the land showed that poor people of color and white, were slowly getting hold of the divided plantations. Some 33,000 plantations were divided among 39,000 small farmers. Virginia, black people acquired between 80,000 and 100,000 acres of land during the late 60s and early 70s. There were soon a few prosperous black farmers with 400 to 1,000 acres of land, and some owners of considerable city property. Georgia black people had bought by 1875 396,658 acres of land, assessed at $1,263,902. And added to this, they had town and city property assessed at $1,203,202 of Arkansas. In 1865, Northoff said, of the 40,000 black voters in the state, it is believed that at least one of 20 owns either a farm or a house and lot in town. This would give but 2,000 such independent landholders, a small number, yet a beginning, showing that even amidst the intense and incessant political turmoil of the last 7 years, a part of the men of color have been persistently disastrous and economical. All this was the record of the exceptional and lucky freedmen. After all, they owned in 1870 less than 1/10 of the land which they ought to have possessed, and the wages of 9/10 of a black laborers were low and seldom paid in cash or with regularity. Wesley gave figures showing annual wages in southern states who have ranged from $89 to $150 in 1876 and 1868. It's 1867 and 1868. Hey, Cisco. On the other hand, this demand for land by government action and the increased disposition to vote public funds for the benefit of pauperized masses insist. Hold on, let me make sure. Insist. I'm gonna make sure. Sometimes easy words just get me.
Incensed.
Incensed. It's incensed. So I did get it right. The planters. I did get it wrong. Hold on a second, everybody. Why are you yelling? Sorry, everybody. I had to get something. My fault. In every southern state, the South from 1868 to 1876 stressed more and more the anomaly of letting people who had no property vote away the wealth of the rich. The strongest statement of the case against the black legislator of South Carolina was that they paid almost no taxes upon property. They who, for the most part, had only had the right to hold property since 1866. This charge against the poor, frequent as it always is in democratic movements, is not valid. The first attempt of the democracy, which includes the previously disenfranchised poor, is to redistribute wealth and income. And this is exactly what the Black South attempted. The theory is that the wealth of the current income of the wealthy ruling class does not belong to them entirely, but is the product of the work and striving of the great millions, and that therefore these millions ought to have a voice in its more equitable distribution. And if this is true in modern countries like France and England and Germany, how much more true was it in the South after the war, where the poorest class represented the most extreme case of theft of labor that the world can conceive, namely chattel slavery? On the other hand, there is not the slightest doubt but that the South had a right to demand of the nation that the whole of the burden of this readjustment of wealth should not fall upon the planters. Guilty as they were of supreme exploitation of labor, their guilt was shared by the rest of the nation, just as the rest of the nation had for centuries shared the profits of the slave system. It would have been far fair and just for the cost of emancipating the slaves and giving them land to be equitable shared by the whole of the United States. Moreover, the increased taxation of which the South was bitterly complained was not wholly for social uplift. It took mainly the form of 1, restoration of injured property, 2, restoration of capital investments lost or injured, as the case of the railroads, 3, the expenses of a new system of public education, 4, the expenses of carrying on the government with enlarged functions. Only the last two, hold on. Yeah, only the last two directly benefit the black workers. There had been a destruction and disappearance of invested capital through war and emancipation, which represented the greater part of the whole invested capital of the South except land. The value of the land decreased enormously because of the disappearance of slave labor and the destruction of the whole industrial system. Accurate figures are out of the question. A report to the House of Representatives, 42nd Congress, gives these estimates. The total assessed property of the South in 1860, including slaves, was, oh my gosh, hold on, $4,363,030,347.05 in 1870, and it was 2,834,184,834,188.02, a loss of $1,634,105,341 in slaves, and 586,990,218 in other property. The total loss in the South by the war in property, assets, and debts, state and Confederate, have been estimated at $5,262,303,554.26. These were the losses of capital. But what of the losses of the 9 million laborers, represented not so much by positive loss as by negative deprivation and exploitation for centuries? The 19th century assumed the universal suffrage would prevent the state from falling into the power of forces inimical of the masses. Let's make sure. I think it's inimical. Make sure. Inimical. Pretty sure it's right. But if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Inimical.
Inimical.
I was right. Something that is hostile, unfriendly, or harmful in its effect. Inimical to the masses. It might and did leave power in the hands of property and invested capital, but it left them less chance to oppress unduly the laboring class, insofar as that class was thrifty and intelligent. But suppose labor was not intelligent and had been so long enslaved that thriftlessness became a virtue. It seems clear that in America and in all leading countries in the latter half of the 19th century, the dictatorship of wealth and capital would be modified in some degree by reference to the will of the masses of laborers. In this way, industrial peace and progress towards high standard of living for the masses would be secure without disturbing the basis of capitalistic production. Thus, the guidance of the dictatorship of capital for the object of private profit were not to be questioned or overthrown, but it must maintain that ascendancy by controlling the public opinion of the laboring class. This was accomplished, and on the whole easily accomplished, by the power to give and withhold employment from people who were without capital, and power to fix wages within certain wide limits, the power to influence public opinion through the prestige of wealth, news and literature, and the power to dominate legislators, courts and offices and administrations. The building and buttressing of the new and more powerful capitalistic imperialism was slow and difficult, and with the purposeful leadership, labor could enormously curtail the power of capital and bring nearer a critical time when the dictatorship of capital must yield to the dictatorship of labor, when general well-being would replace individual profits as the object of industry. This was not so clear in detail in the middle of the 19th century as it is now. There were Democrats like Sumner and Stevens who sensed the new power which supercapital was beginning to assert over labor and practically over universal suffrage. Still, it seemed to them that the right to vote in the hands of the intelligent mass could dictate the form of any state that it wished. The difficulty was that the mass of labor, and particularly black labor, was not intelligent. They freely admitted, therefore, that while it would be better to give the right of suffrage only to those black people who were intelligent, and particularly those who, by economic opportunity, would amass some little capital, nevertheless, they felt that since the South compelled them to choose between universal suffrage and disenfranchised landless labor in the control of landholders and capitalists, with increased political power based on the disenfranchisement of labor and the right of suffrage, even in the hands of the poor and ignorant, gave better chances for ultimate economic justice than their disenfranchisement. It was for this reason that they advocated universal suffrage for the emancipated slaves. They were offered no middle ground. There were in the South only spasmodic signs that any powerful body of public opinion was willing to admit that black people to the right of suffrage, no matter how intelligent he became, or to admit white labor without nullifying its vote by giving to capital the power based on disenfranchised black people. Yet without some acceptance of a labor vote, the modern state could not endure. And while the cost of introducing this sudden change in the South was great, yet the action of the dominant South left no alternative. It was either universal suffrage or modified slavery, and in either case, increased political power in the nation from the former slave oligarchy. Moreover, it was certain that unless the right to vote had been given the black person by federal law in 1867, he would never have got it in America. There never has been a time since when race propaganda in America offered the slightest chance for people of color to receive American citizenship. There would have been, therefore, perpetuated in the South and in America a permanently disenfranchised mass of laborers, and the dictatorship of capital would under those circumstances have been even more firmly implanted than it is today. Certainly and naturally, the slaves were far more arrogant, ignorant, and poverty-stricken than the mass of northern white laborers. A dictatorship of federal power was therefore set up in the first Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which would have furnished them land and schools and protected their civil and economic rights until they were ready for universal suffrage or had learned by using it. The bill, as finally passed, left out the provision for land and most of the provisions for education. Black people themselves continued to demand land when they were enfranchised by the Reconstruction Bill of 1867. But this invoked shrieks and anger from property in the South and apprehension from property in the North. There arose in the South an extraordinary situation which few scholars have studied in its economic aspects. First, there was black labor, in the main ignorant and poor, but with some leaders of intelligence, backed the party by a military power of the North. Secondly, there were white exploitation, which in the South had been based on the ownership of land and labor, and which was now widely impoverished, but still left with most of the land, some capital, and large social influences. There was, in addition to those, the mass of impoverished and arrogant, ignorant white peasants and laborers. To this, there were added a number of northern immigrants with smaller or larger amounts of capital. It is idle to speculate as to just how this situation could have been avoided. Of course, it would have not risen if slavery had continued. Moreover, there would have been less evident catastrophe and turmoil immediately if slavery had been continued under another name, in accordance with the efforts of the Southern states under the Johnson Reconstruction Plan. But this simply meant a postponement of the trouble. Eventually, the complete agrarian capitalist system, based on the ownership of both land and labor, had to disappear from America, and the world at its disappearance had to spell revolution, involving a vast transfer of capital and political power. This revolution might have taken the form of annulling property in slaves with indemnity to the slave owners, and seek to put it into the South a laboring class without political power. This would have been an impossible solution, because this laboring class would have been thrown into even more direct competition with white laborers and land over, and a fact which had already been the cause of civil war, and it would have involved an attempt at capitalist autocracy. Without the corrective and universal suffrage among a third of the American laboring class. Moreover, the capital Moreover, the capital to indemnify the slave owners must have come out of the wealth of that part of the country whose capital was being taxed to pay the staggering cost of the war to overthrow political power based on enslaving labor. Northern capital would not consent to restore Southern loss from investment in slaves, much less if they restored capital where to be used to compete with capital in the North. There ensued in the South a contest of ultimate dictatorship of the state in conjunction with universal suffrage, or black and white. A temporary dictatorship set up by the federal government represents and had to represent, in essence, the attitude of Northern capitalists. The parties that hoped to dominate this dictatorship, all of them lacked capital. The planters had been impoverished by the war. The small capitalists from the North had to come south, brought little to invest, but accepted to accumulate capital on the spot, and the poor white represented the impoverished peasantry and labor class, as well as the petite bourgeoisie of small merchant and professional men. Here, then, was the situation, and what had to follow. The planters had to move towards the control of the political power of newly enfranchised labor, both black and white. One can see such movements in the constant of Beauregard and Longstreet in Louisiana, Alcorn in Mississippi, and Hampton in South Carolina, to black suffrage and their willingness to concede something of economic power to the black voters. But this movement, which would have been comparatively simple under the ordinary organization of capital and labor in modern countries, was complicated by three facts. First, there came in a new, eager class of competing capitalists who proposed to share with the planters the dictatorship of labor. Secondly, the movement of the planter class to attract black labor with economic concessions met with immediate and bitter fear and opposition of the poor whites, not simply of the mass of half-starved white peasants and farmers, but of the merchants, the former slave overseers and managers, men who proposed to join the planters as exploiters of labor. These desperately feared and rise of black labor to the position which might equal and even surpass the poor whites. This was shown in the voting in Alabama under Johnson's Reconstruction. Here, where the poor white counties went solidly against the black belt on several occasions, and it was also shown in a bitter opposition to the counting of black folks as a basis of representation. If the whole population was to be counted as a basis of representation, then after the war, as before, the black belt and its capitalistic dictators were going to dominate white labor, and it was for this reason that the poor whites long fought to exclude black people in apportioning of political power of the state, and after Reconstruction, united in disenfranchising him. When black people received the right to vote and had to be counted, there arose a desperate effort on the part of the poor whites to keep the planters from controlling the black vote by their economic power. Sometimes this effort took the crude method of driving black labor off the plantations and intimidating in various ways. Sometimes it took the form of trying to lead black labor through demagogues like Honeycutt in Virginia, and all the time in the background was the feeling that unless the planters united with the poor whites in a solid radical phalanx against the black voters, anarchy and destruction were preferable to the economic rise of black people. How this interaction of former land monopolists, white peasants and black peasants, would have worked itself out of uncomplicated by other interests. is a question. But it seems most inevitable that the division would have had to take place along economic rather than racial lines, and that the planter capitalists, reinforcing themselves with recruits from the poor white petty bourgeois, would have organized to control white and black labor, endowed with universal suffrage along the same lines that allowed capital in the North to control native white labor and new immigrants. There entered, however, a small northern investor, usually and inaccurately comprehend under the term of carpetbaggers, a phrase too vague for us for our use, but too much used to discard. When the war ended, there were a large number of northern soldiers and officers in the South. There were civilian agents in the government and there were other northerners who looked towards the South as a place of economic rebirth and investment. There was nothing extraordinary in this. Thousands upon thousands of Southerners had come into the North and had been welcomed to its freedom and opportunities, while this migration of the South had come mainly in a time of war, with the resultant war hatred and bitterness. Still, its main reason was economic. Men with smaller and larger amounts of capital, and many with no capital, proposed to invest in land and free labor in the South at a time when the great staples of Southern agriculture were abnormally high and in wide demand throughout the world. These men, so far as they were investing capitalists, and most of them were proposed to build up in the South the same kind of capitalistic democracy based on universal suffrage, to which they had been used in the North. They were going to trade with free black labor and white labor and yield to it that amount of consideration and that economic share of the product, which they would naturally have to yield in order to keep their dictatorship and yet get profits for themselves. If now the new northern capitalists and the southern planter class had been united into a new capitalistic class, their only problem would have been to deal with the new laboring class composed of black people and whites, and to admit to their ranks those of either class who had or could get any amount of new capital. But both capitalists and laborers were split in two. There was hatred and jealousy in the ranks of this new prospective capitalist class and race, prejudice and fear in the ranks of the laborers and the new capitalist class, the hatred of the planters and northerners, who apparently were planning to add to the conquest of war, new conquest of economic power, was naturally intense. It was this same power of northern capital which in southern minds caused civil war. The new northern capitalists, on the other hand, could not understand why they should not be welcomed as investors without sentiment in a region where investment of new capital was sadly needed, why this should not be accompanied by the same attitude towards labor which capital must take throughout the world if it were going to maintain its mastery. Thirdly, the poor whites began a desperate and almost panic-stricken attempt to force themselves into this situation, either as allies of the old planter class, which had for them the greatest contempt, or as allies of the carpetbaggers, capitalists, against whom they had just been fighting in the ranks of the army, and whose attitude towards black labor they did not understand and feared, or even as allies of black labor, which they might use as a club against both planters and capitalists. The ensuing turmoil in the South was a fight of these three pretenders to economic power over the capitalistic state, and also it was further complicated by the fact that the federal military dictatorship was in the hands of the northern capitalists and northern social workers. There ensued a fierce fight of mastery characterized by widespread graft, corruption and violence. For what possibility did any of these parties have to a state they did not own, and a greater and failure of government through any of the contenders, the more it justified radical change. When the planter class moved back towards black labor, its leaders made demands which the planters would not meet, namely demands for land, education, and the expense of social uplift. These demands of the black laborer might have been modified if they had not found that they were easily promised and partially fulfilled by the carpetbag capitalists. He therefore turned to the carpetbaggers for leadership, and through him was given education and at least a possibility to buy land. The poor whites could try to compete with the carpetbag capitalists in leadership and demagoguery over black people. Or he could seek alliance with the planters because the planters' property was bearing the main cost of the new educational social program. Or by sabotaging, he could seek to sink the government in anarchy. Small wonder that the ensuing grift, stealing, and renewal of the Civil War was widely misunderstood. But the very last place where the blame for this situation could be the wildest imitation, one place was upon the newly franchised black labor. What black people needed and what he desperately sought was leadership in knowledge and industry. And knowledge he wanted through his own irrepressible demand for education to become an intelligent citizen. And a start towards this he received through the splendid and unselfish cooperation of the northern social workers, connected with the federal dictatorship, and through their allies, the teachers who came down to man the Freedmen's Bureau School by straining his political power to the utmost, the black vote, got a public school system, and got it because that was the one clear object which he understood, and which no bribery or chicanery should subdue him from advocating and insisting upon any seasons and out. On the other hand, the economic leadership in the whole question, the whole question of work and wage, he was almost entirely at sea. His higher school based on New England capitalism and individualism gave little training for an economic battle, just drawing in the world and far from the conception of leaders in Southern industries. Even his later industrial schools were tied hand and foot to triumph capitalism, unhampered by the labor vote. He had then but one clear economic deal, and that was his demand for land, his demand that the great plantations be subdivided and given to him as his right. This was a perfectly fair and natural demand, and ought to have been an integral part of emancipation. To emancipate 4 million laborers whose labor had been owned and separated them from the land upon which they had worked for nearly 2.5 centuries was an operation such as no modern country had for a moment attempted or contemplated. The German and English and French serfs, the Italian and Russian serfs were on emancipation, given definite rights in the land. Only the American black slave was emancipated without such rights, and in the end was spelled for him the continuation of slavery. Beyond this demand for land, so they never got like peasantry, because coming from a slave system, the peasantry, peasants are tied to land and they get some of their own land for their own subsistence, but they still like do taxes and they still like grow and cultivate for the noble leaders and royalty and stuff like that. But like some of their subsistence is due to like having their own land, so they're not really tied to wages. I don't think, wages don't come into. I don't think comes into. I think it's in the gilded areas where there was guilds and stuff and apprentices, but most peasants were tied to the land and stuff like that. Beyond this demand of land, economic leadership for the black failed. He appealed to his former master, the best of the planters, whose those who in slavery days had occupied a patriarchal position towards their slaves were besieged not only by their own former slaves, but by others for advice and leadership. If they had wished, they could have held the black vote in the palm of their hands. Black people would have followed them implicitly, and it was this that poor whites, from Andrew Johnson down, feared. But they forgot that the planters were stopped from this program by their own lack of capital, by the new and confiscatory. I don't know this word. I think it's confiscatory. I think it's confiscatory. I'm gonna look it up. Confiscatory. Not too many people staying in, huh? It's me and my shadows. Just kidding. And of course, it won't let me do that. I think it's confiscatory. An action, policy, or penalty involving the seizure of property or assets, often by the government or authorities. Confiscatory taxation, which black people demands, entail even under the most frugal and honest administration. By their own singular lack of knowledge of the methods of capitalist democracy throughout the world, which was based on those very concessions to labor, of which they could not conceive. They kept insisting on hard, regular toil, vague and irregular wages, and no exercise of political power. All this in a day when labor and the world over demanded shorter hours, indefinite high-wage contracts, and the right to vote. To this attitude, the planters. Oh wait, who's in? Oh, I'm doing a reading, so I'm not accepting people. Sorry. This attitude of the planters must be added in bitter jealousy, not only of the worst and more vicious and selfish of the planters, but of the poor whites. And when there was added to this the fact that they themselves were being supplanted as advisors of black people by the new white northern capitalist, willing to grant labor demands at the expense of the state, they, in most cases, utterly refused to leave black labor, and thus threw the black people back on the carpetbag capitalists for advice and leadership. Thither, too, black people were attracted by a trust of naturally grew out of the fact that these people represented their emancipation. They represented Abraham Lincoln and his government. And black people were naturally strongly inclined to do anything that this leadership told them to do, even when the advice was dishonest and other unwise. Thus were the freemen landed in piteous contradictions and difficulty. Black people owned black leadership was naturally the many sort. Some, like the whites, were petty bourgeoisie, seeking to climb to wealth. Others were educated men, helping to develop the new nation without regards to mere race lines, while the third group was idealists, trying to uplift the black race and put them on a par with the whites. But how was this to be accomplished? In the midst of very few of them, was there any clear and distinct plan for the development of the laboring class into the position of power and mastery over the modern industrial state? And in this lack of vision, they were not singular in America. Where else in the land, even among labor leaders, was there any such fixed and definite program of action? The fight for the domination of the new form of state, which Reconstruction was building, took a direction of using the income for new forms of state expenses. And for that, public investments for private profit was widespread custom in the North. The South had entered only to a small extent into such schemes and tended to regard them as outside the function of the state. Even the forms of expenditures for education and the help of indigents were kinds of expenditures to which the Southern taxpayers had not been used and in which, for the most part, they did not believe. There were consequently fierce outcries against the quote waste of such expenditures, when in addition to that, there came widespread and deliberate investments to public funds and railroads, and corporations where the profits went to speculators and grifters. The protest of landed property was intensified. The result of this form of stealing bore hard upon the impoverished landholders, and were particularly detestable to him because monopolizing the government before the war had largely escaped taxation and had tried to transfer it to the soldiers, the shoulders, not soldiers, soldiers of the small businessmen. Now the small businessman, reinforced by the carpetbaggers and black voter, was returning it to the landholders. Assessments were increased, and the gradual disestablishment of the landed aristocracy became imminent. Here is the crux of the matter. It was this large and, for a day and circumstances, overwhelming loss that laid at the bottom of the extraordinary charges and extravagance and stealing that characterized the Reconstruction controversy. For had there been no further loss and no necessity nor effort to increase the customary taxation of the past, the planters would have felt hurt in his heart by the disappearance of the bulk of his capital. But when to this was added a new taxation for uplifting black people and enriching Northerners, he raised his protest to a shriek of bitterness. When we try to get to the details of the Southern states' debts after the war and during Reconstruction, we were faced by the fact that there is no agreement among authorities. The reason for this are several. First, what is a debt? It is the amount which a state actually owes, or is it the amount for which the state may become liable in the future? By reasons of this latter case, for how much does it actually become liable? A careful examination of such facts as seem established shows that the increase of debt under the Reconstruction regime was not large. In 11 Southern states, there was little over, $100 million of debt in 1860, which rose to $222 million on account of war, when the Confederate debt was repudiated and the recognized debt of 1865 stood at $156 million. To this should be added certain railroad liabilities of Alabama, which brings the total debt at the beginning of the Reconstruction to $175 million. In 1871, this debt had increased nearly 100% to $305 million. But $100 million of this debt consisted in contingent and prospective liabilities due to the issue of railway bonds, which confused the whole issue with regard to Reconstruction debts. The whole increase of debt during 1860 to 1871 amounted apparently to less than 100%. What now did this increase of debt do to the railway bonds mean? It meant that Southern and Northern men, Republicans and Democrats, had united to put the credits of the state back of their railway investment. The only way in which 9/10 of black voters came into this matter was as their representatives were bribed by both parties to support this legislation for private profit. Such bribery undoubtedly was widespread, but it was widespread not only among black voters, but among white voters, and among all the voters of the United States, and among members of all legislators and members of Congress. It could hardly be argued that, in this respect, new and largely arrogant black voters should show a higher public morality than the rest of the country. On the other hand, the wrath of the landholders against this increase in debt was the wrath of agrarian capitalists against the new industrialism. And yet they were unable to prosecute those who stole the state money through this issue of railway bonds, because there were too many Southern people and Southern people of prominence involved. So too high power people, they weren't going to do that. Kind of reminds me of the Epstein class. They're able to get away with whatever they want. And I do that to be particular. Sorry, everybody. This was shown in North Carolina, where despite the extravagant investments in railways, the hope of wide immigration and rapid development was disappointed, and the landholders put a commercialist out of power. But they did not dare prosecute them. In Mississippi, on the other hand, there were black people who was as powerful as any state. There was no increase of debt because from the first landholders, and black people refused to loan the credit of the state to the railroads. If the money raised by taxes had been spent carefully and honestly upon legitimate and necessary matters of restoration of the government, the increase is not unreasonable. Or in other words, there is nothing on the face of the figures that prove unusual theft. Over 150 million of this debt was repudiated by the reactionary government, which came into office after 1876. John F. Hume claims that to this should be added $121 million of debts repudiated before the Civil War, showing that the South was not unused to dealing with this way with borrowed funds. The indebtedness must also be interpreted by considering the price of gold. South Carolina's debt of 21 million in 1871 was made when paper money was at 70 and was therefore equivalent to 15.5 million in 1860. Indeed, the curve of the price of gold explains to some extent the curve of alleged extravagance. The debt of these states between the time when it reached its highest point in 1880 was scaled down to $108,394,974. This meant that a sum of $155,525,856 was repudiated, and it would be noted that this was almost exactly the increased indebtedness which the Reconstruction regime occurred in order to meet the increased burden of the state. Public school education, charitable institutions, and restorations of public buildings, and the increase of social responsibilities. There can be no possible proof that all of this increased indebtedness represented theft, nor is there any adequate reasons for believing that most of it did. What happened in Southern repudiation after the war was that the Southern states proceeded to punish people who had dared to loan money to the Southern states under black suffrage by confiscating the sum which they had loaned. This is what they had threatened to do, and they did it with vengeance. There are certain other considerations. White Southerners were in practically complete control during the Reconstruction regime in Virginia and Tennessee. Yet, in these two states, an indebtedness of $52 million in 1860 increased to $88 million before 1880, and $34 million of this was repudiated. This could hardly be charged to black suffrage. Then, in North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, the ex-Confederate South never lost all control and was early restored to full control. Yet these states at indebtedness of $19 million in 1860 reached $81 million before 1880, and of this, $56 million was repudiated. A part of the blame of this may be shouldered not on white Northerners, but very little of it could possibly be attributed to black people. In the case of Florida and Mississippi, the debt was negligible and on the face of it, absolutely indefensible. Yet, large amounts of repudiated by the former Reform Party in South Carolina that stood to nearly $6 million in 1865 before Reconstruction. It reached at its highest point before 1880s to nearly $25 million. And of this, $17 million was repudiated. If any large proportion of it represented theft, it represented as much as illegal graft of Northern money lenders as the theft of money actually received by the state. Arkansas, under the government in which black people had almost no part, repudiated $12 million out of $18 million of indebtedness. The whole debt transaction of the South after Reconstruction seemed to show that many of the accusations of unreasonable debt and the haste at repudiation were a blow aimed at Northern finance, rather than a proof of black extravagance. Hey, Kevin. It was openly said in Louisiana that it was fitting that, quote, the Northerners who tore down the bases of our former prosperity should share some of the ills. Sir George Campbell said, here's what he said: all the carpetbag governors are, as a matter of course, accused of the grossest personal corruption, and as soon as they fall from power, it is almost a necessity that they should fly from criminal prosecution instituted in the local courts under circumstances which give little security for fair trials. On the whole, then, I am inclined to believe that the period of carpetbag rule was rather a scandal than a very prominent injury, and there was more pilfering than plundering on the scale of permanently to cripple the state. Indeed, in most cases, the testimony concerning stealing and corruption in the South during this time was either given by bitter political opponents who constituted themselves judge, witness, and jury, or by criminals who were clearing their own skirts by accusing others. Note well the character of the stealing in the South. In the first place, when money was appropriated, when extravagantly it was appropriated for railroads, which the South needed desperately, and it was appropriated under the same terms that had enabled the North and the West to get their railroads. It was appropriated for public institutions. It was appropriated for the buying of land in order to subdivide the great plantations. It was appropriated for certain public services. In all cases, the grift and dishonesty came in the carrying out, the fulfillment of these needs. If this was not only in the hands of white men, but Southern white men, as often as Northern and Northern white financial agents and manipulators in Wall Street helped to make the bond sales of South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. To charge these debts to black people is not smart. It was not so charged at the time, but this came to be a popular vision of Southern corruption when it became unpopular to accuse the Northerner. In the original charges of graft and corruption made by the Southerners, black people were mentioned only as tools. It was the carpetbaggers and the scallywags, Northern and Southern white men, who were continually and insistently charged with theft and corruption. Then, as the carpetbaggers lost the power of military dictatorship, and as a prospect of alliance with poor whites showed the planters a way of resecuring the government, they turned and with the poor whites concentrated all their accusations and misgovernment and corruption upon black people in order to deprive black people of his political power. Southern corruption was not the exclusive guilt of scallywags and carpetbaggers, nor were all carpetbaggers and scallywags thieves. Some carpetbaggers were noble-hearted philanthropists. Some scallywags were self-sacrificing benefactors of both black people and whites. Some of the scallywags and carpetbaggers lied and stole, and some helped incorporated with the freemen and worked for real democracy in the South for all races. Indeed, a grift and theft, the skirts of Southern whites of all classes were not clear before or after the war. Before the war, the South was ruled by an oligarchy, and the functions of the state carried largely by individuals. This meant that the state had little to do, and its expenses were small. The oligarchic state does not need to restore to corruption of the government, its leaders having the right to exploit labor to the limit, received an income which makes them conspicuously independent of any income from the government. The government revenues are kept purposely small and the salaries low so that poor men cannot afford to enter into the government service. On the other hand, when the oligarchy is broken down and when labor increases its power, revenue is raised by taxing the rich. And then the temptation to bribery and stealing increases according to the amount of property. The corruptions of the South before the war did not usually touch the state governments. The income there was too small to be tempting. Yet in Mississippi, after 2 receivers of public money had defaulted for $155,000, a United States Treasury agent recommended that the last one be retained, since another would probably be as bad. Other Southern states had defaulting officials and shamelessly repudiated their public debts. For 30 years, during 1830 to 1860, the South was ruled by its own best citizen. And yet during that time, there was defolication. Let me find out what this word says. Ooh, wrong one. Appreciate it. Appreciate all the likes. Thank you for coming through. Oh, it's not gonna let me do it. Delfolkashua. I can't say it. Hold on. Do it YouTube.
Look at this.
Ah, I gotta read the thing.
A few lines and we're safe, right? Too easy.
Defalcation. And that means defalcation. It's an interesting word. A misappropriation, misuse, or failure to properly account for money or, okay. So yeah. In Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, and Arkansas, among postmasters, United States marshals, collectors of surveyors, amounted to more than $1 million. How far then was postbellum corruption due to black people? Only insofar that they represented ignorance and poverty, and were thus particularly susceptible to petty bribery. No one contends that any considerable amount of money went to them. There were some reports of how the extravagance among them, but the great thieves were always white men. Very, very few black leaders were specifically accused of theft, and again, seldom in these cases were the accusation proven. Usually they were vague slurs resting on the assumption that all black people steal. Petty bribery of members of Reconstruction legislators, white and black, was widespread. But Wallace in Florida shows the desperate inner turmoil of black people to counteract this within their own ranks. An outstanding case of notably uncorruptible black leaders was Lieutenant Governor Dunn of Louisiana, Treasurer Cardozo of South Carolina, Secretary of State Gibbs of Florida, and Speaker Lynch of Mississippi are well known. Certainly, the mass of black people were unbridlable when it came to demands for land and education and other things. The beneficent. Make sure. I think it's beneficent. I'm like second guessing the word sometimes. Benefic. Beneficent. Okay. Someone or something that does good, produces beneficial results. Okay. It's beneficent objects, of which they, for land and education and other things. Oh yeah, I said that. Of which they could thoroughly understand. But they were particularly susceptible to bribes when it was a matter of personal following of demagogues who catered to their likes and weaknesses. The mass of black people were accused of selling votes and influencing for small sums, and of this being easily brought up by big thieves. But even in this, they were usually bought up by pretended friends and not bribed against their beliefs or by enemies, to the principle that they understood and knew they were true. But there were many things connected with the government and its technical, which they did not know. In other words, they were arrogant, ignorant, and poor, and the ignorant and poor can always be misled and bribed. It made the black poor and ignorant, ? Surely it was slavery, and he tried with his vote to escape slavery, as Dunn says. As to corruption under the black government of the South, this must be noted. First, the decade when black people were ushered into political life from 1867 to 1877 was probably the most corrupt decade in the history of the United States, in all parts of the United States. The form and manner of this corruption, which was given so unsavory a connotation to the name Reconstruction, were no different from those which had appeared in many other times and places in democratic societies. At the very time, indeed, when the administration of Scott in South Carolina and Warmoth in Louisiana were establishing the southern high water mark of rascality in public finance, and Tweed Rings of New York City was in a culmination of its closely parallel career. When we come to examine them, the charges made by such men as Rhodes, Oberholtz, Dunning, Bowers, etc., even in taking at their face value, which they surely should be, are charges that might, with equal force, be leveled against every government, federal, state, and municipal, North and South, Republican and Democrat of the time, and against the lily-white Restoration governments that followed in the South with reaction, only compared to public money stolen by officers of Reconstruction government, with the vast sum that found their way into the pockets of the Tweed Ring and perfectly conservative Democratic Copperhead City of New York. It may be contended that the presence of the mass of unlettered and inexperienced voters in the state make bribery and graft easier and more capable of misusing by malign elements. This is true. But the question is the situation any better if ignorance and poverty are permanently disenfranchised? The whole answer of modern industrial conditions is no, it is not. The only alternative, therefore, is the one continually urged by Sumner, Phillips, and Stevens. If ignorance is dangerous, instruct it. If poverty is the cause of stealing and crime, increase the income of the masses. Poverty involves theft by the rich for the poor. But there comes a grave question. Given a mass of ignorancy and poverty, is that mass less dangerous without the ballot? The answer to this depends upon upon whose danger one envisages. They are not dangerous to the mass of laboring men if they are kept in ignorance and poverty and dominated by capital. They are certainly dangerous to capital. To escape such revolution and prolong its sway, property must yield political power to the mass of laborers and let it wield that power more intelligently by giving it public schools and higher wages. It is naturally easier for capital to do this gradually. And if there could have been a choice in 1867 between the effective public school system and black labor in the South, it is gradually enfranchisement, or even beyond that, a property qualification for such laborers as through free land and higher wages had some chance of accumulating some property. If this had been possible, it would have been without doubt the best transition program for capital and labor, providing of course that capitalists thus tamely yield power. But there was no such alternative. Black labor, must be either enfranchised or enslaved, unless, of course, the United States government was not willing to come in with a permanent Freedmen's Bureau to train black people towards economic freedom and against the interests of Southern capital. This was revolution. This was force, and no such permanent Freedmen's Bureau, backed by a strongly capitalistic Northern government, could have been expected in 1867. The essential problem of black enfranchisement was this: how far is the poor and ignorant electorate a permanent injury to the state, and how far does the extent of their injury make for efforts to counteract it? More than 1 million black people were enfranchised in 1876. Of these, it is possible that between 100,000 to 200,000 would read and write, and certainly not more than 25,000, including black immigrants from the North, could be called educated. It was the theory that if these people were given the right to vote, the state, first of all, would be compelled to discontinue plans of political action or industrial organizations which did not accord with the general plans of the North. And secondly, in self-defense, it would have to begin the education of free men and establish a system of free labor with wages and condition of work much fairer than those in vogue during slavery. How far was this a feasible social program? It was not possible, of course. If the South had the right to continue its industrial organization based on land monopoly and ownership of labor, conceding the emancipation of labor, that emancipation meant nothing. If land monopoly continued and the wage contract was merely nominal. If the wage system was to be installed, it must receive protection either from the outside power, like that of the federal government, or from the worker himself. So far as the worker was concerned, the only protection feasible was the ballot in the hands of the united and intelligently led working class. Could it be assumed now that the possession of the ballot in the hands of ignorant working people, black and white, would lead to real economic emancipation? Or on the other hand, would it not become a menace to the state so great that its very existence would be threatened? It had been the assistant contention to many of the bases of the state was threatened between 1867 and 1876, and therefore the revolution of 1876 had to take place. The known fact do not sustain this contention, and it seemed probable that if we had preserved a more complete story of the action of black voters, the fact in his favor would have been stronger. As it is, it must be remembered that the proponents of black suffrage did not for a moment contend that the experiment was not difficult and would not involve hardship and danger. The election of the convention went off, for the most part, without upheaval, with intelligence, and certainly with unusual fairness. The conduct of black voters, their selection of candidates, their action in convention and earlier legislature was on the whole sane, thoughtful and sincere. No one can, with any color for truth, say that civilization was threatened or the foundation of the state attacked in the South in the years from 1868 to 1876. Then, however, came a time of decision. Did the South want black people to become an intelligent voter, a participant in the state under any circumstances, or, on the other hand, was it opposed to black voters, no matter how intelligent and efficient? Okay, real quick, I'm going to put a bookmark. I want to see if I'm any close to a stopping point. So adding a bookmark, 682. 682. No, it doesn't look too well. Looks like whoa, wait, no, long way to go still. Yeah, so I'm only on 692 and it's not even, okay, 682. They just don't want black people they just want to have control. That's all they want. They're using white people to get the control over the black vote. All right, 682, right? Okay. It may be said then that the argument for giving the right to vote to mass of the poor and ignorant still stands indefensible without for a moment denying that there should not be such a class in any civilized community. But if the class is there, the fault is the fault of the community, and the community must suffer and pay for it. The South had exploited black labor for nearly 2.5 centuries. If in 10 years or 20 years things could be so changed that this class was receiving an education, getting hold of land, exercising some control over capital, becoming co-partners in the state, the South would be particularly fortunate community. If, on the other hand, there had been a moral strength in the South so that without yielding immediate political power, they could have educated and uplifted black people and gradually inducted them into political power and real industrial emancipation, the result undoubtedly would have been better. There was no such disposition. And under the profit deal of the capitalist organization, there could not have been. That would have required, after the losses of war and industrial unselfishness, of which capitalist organizations does not for a moment omit. Force, therefore, and outside force had to be applied, or otherwise slavery would have persisted in a but slightly modified form, and persisted in the persistence of slavery in the United States longer than it had already persisted, would have been a calamity worse than any of the calamities, real or imagined, of Reconstruction. Consequently, with Northern white leadership, the black voters quite confounded the planters' plan. They proved apt pupils in politics. They developed their own leadership. They gained clearer and clearer conceptions of how their political power could be used for their own good. They were unselfish too, in wishing to include in their own good the white worker and even the ex-master. Of course, all of that was done in the Constitution, making the legislation at this time was not entirely the work of black men. And in the same way, all that was done is maladministration. maladministration, and corruption was not entirely the fault of black men. But if black men is to be blamed for the ills of Reconstruction, he must also be credited for its good, and that good is indubitably. In less than 10 years, the basic structure of capitalism in the South was changed by his vote. A new modern state was erected in the place of agrarian slavery, and its foundations were so sound and its great plan so good that despite bitter efforts, the South had to accept universal suffrage in theory at last, and had to accept the public school system. It had to broaden social control by adding to the landholders the industrial capitalists. Indeed, the black voter in Reconstruction had disappointed all the prophets. The bravest of the carpetbaggers, Torgny, declared concerning the black voter, quote, "They instituted a public school system in the realm where public school had been unknown. They opened the ballot box and jury box to thousands of white men who had been debarred from them by the lack of earthly possessions. They introduced home rule in the South. They abolished the whipping post and branded iron and stock and other barbarous forms of punishment, which had up to that time prevailed. They reduced capital felonies from about 20 to 2 or 3. And the age of extravagance, they were extravagant in the sum appropriated for public works. In all the times, no man's rights of persons were invaded under the forms of law. Black people buttressed Southern civilization in precisely the places it was weakest against popular ignorance, oligarchy in government, and land monopoly. His school were more and more successful. If now he became a recognized part of the state, a larger and larger decree of social inequality must be granted him. This was apparent in his demand for a single system of public schools without discrimination of race, a demand that came for obvious reasons of economy as well as for advantages of social contact. It appeared also in the demand for equal accommodations on railroads and in public places. Ultimately, of course, a single system of public school, a state university without distinction of race and equality of civil rights was going to lead to some social intermingling and attacks upon the anti-intermarriage laws, which encourage I don't know this word. We're almost done, everybody. All 3 people. Miscegenation, the marriage, cohabitation of sexual relations between people of different race groups. Miscegenation, and deliberately degraded women. This was a possibility that the planter class could not contemplate without concerns, and it stirred among the poor whites a blind and unreasoning fury. A dictatorship of labor in the South then, with the establishment of democratic control over the social development, education, and public improvements, succeeded only at the expense of taxation on land and property, which amounted to confiscation, and it was accompanied by a waste of public funds, partly due to the inexperience and partly due to the prevailing wave of political dishonesty that engulfed the whole country. Hold on a second. The singular thing about the wholesale charge of stealing and corruptions during the Reconstruction times is that when the government was restored to the whites and to the Democratic Party, there were so few attempts at criminal indictment or to secure any return of the loot. In North Carolina, for instance, wholesale theft was charged against the carpetbaggers, and yet, when the governor and leader of the Republican Party was impeached no charge of stealing was in the indictment. He was impeached for using the militia to put down admitted and widespread disorder, and for the arrest of the men who openly and impudently encouraged the disorder. In Mississippi, all the restored government apparently wanted to get rid of Governor Ames. They made no attempt to charge him with theft. In South Carolina, the restored government claimed to have documentary evidence of widespread stealing and grift. And they made a few indictments, which were afterward quietly squashed. Why did not the fraud committee go into court, which they now control, and find out where the money they alleged was stolen had gone, and who was now enjoying it? The conclusion is almost inescapable that the fraud committee knew perfectly well that the large proportions of the thieves were now on the side of white rule, and that much they were theft, and had been besieged and calculated to discredit black people and carpetbaggers. These facts and similar ones show the overthrow of Reconstruction. Actually, I'm going to stop right there. That seems a good spot. What do you guys think? You think it's a good spot? Or do you think that's a horrible spot to stop at? Good spot or horrible spot? Good spot. Okay. I will take your word for it. Oh my gosh. Do. Have to go back. Add a bookmark. All right. Go to bookmarks. Holy shit. All right. 684. That's where we're starting at. So, they're trying to again blame black people. Who's this? Joe's alt. Let's close this out. I'm going to disconnect this one.
All right. Hello.
Hello. Say something. Gotta go off mute.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. So it was a really good reading. I'm not surprised that the white people that were accusing the people of color of stealing were actually the ones stealing. That sounds perfectly typical. I'm not sure what else I want to say. So go ahead and I'll come in after you.
No, I said what I said. They're just blaming black people and like they're utilizing poor whites to try to control the black vote by bribing them and manipulating them. And I understand the whole thing that it's easier to manipulate people that are not educated and these kind of things. You know what I mean? So I understand that. So it's purposely done to keep them manipulated. That's why they wouldn't do those things. So it's just the whole controlling black vote. We see that now going on in one of the states where they're doing like, what are they doing? They're doing gerrymandering and they're getting approved for that. And that's controlling the black vote in a sense and giving black people less power within the political process.
Yeah, they're doing that all over the South. They did it in Louisiana. They got rid of the 2 black districts. They did it in Tennessee. They got rid of the Memphis district, and they're doing it all over the South right now.
It goes to prove that voting is not going to help. It doesn't work in the United States because they get who they want anyways. Someone that's going to uphold the capital, the dictatorship of capital, and the dictatorship of like the ruling class, because that's what they're doing. So this is just all like construction of how like we deal with today's issue. This is why voting doesn't work. Like all those rights that they fought for just being thrown away, giving the conclusion that we can't vote for good things. We have to actually overthrow and replace completely. And that's all I have.
Yeah, me too. It was a great reading. Thank you, Drew.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right then. Well, since